Hey everyone, National Master Steven Adams here. Today I want to talk to you about a very important concept in chess, which is increasing the advantage. Many times we find ourselves in positions where we feel that we should be better, but it's unclear what to do next. Here we see that white is better due to the bishop pair and the weakness of this black pawn on d6. However, usually one weakness is not enough. Our opponent can hunker down and defend, and they'll be able to stop our attempts if we just try to focus only on one weakness. So, here's the key to increasing the advantage. You need to give your opponent an additional weakness. But, of course, it's easy for me to sit here and just tell you to, magically create a weakness. How do we practically and actually go about doing this? So, the best way to create an additional weakness is through pawn play. Our strategy in these sorts of positions should be to push pawns in the correct area, gain space, and then use that space to force a concession from our opponent. So, with that said, I'll ask you now, how can we gain space here, and which side of the board should we be trying to do this on? So you can pause here, and then I'll tell you in 3, 2, 1. So, the right place to gain space on is the king side. And this is because we have an advantage here. We have 4 pawns to our opponent's 3. And so if you're trying to push pawns, you always want to push pawns on the side where you had the majority if you're trying to get space. You want to push pawns on the side where you are stronger. So I started off with h3. My goal is I want to play f4, but I didn't want to go at the g4 square immediately. I didn't want to allow any counterplay. And after my opponent played rook a to b8, they're potentially defending this b7 pawn after f4 opens up this diagonal. And now my opponent makes a poor move. They go with g6, and this simply loses a pawn. But I think their position was going to be very difficult regardless, because otherwise we are simply playing, g4, bishop f3, and g5, and h4, and we are pushing them back. We are pushing them back a lot. So I think either way they're in big trouble. g6 tries to stop any sort of f5 breaks, but this simply loses the pawn to bishop takes f6, king takes f6, and pawn to e5. And after king to e7, they can't take because of the pin that was on this rook, so I had to go king to e7, but here we just trade on d6. And now we're up a pawn. And so we've converted that advantage into an extra pawn. But of course the game's not over with yet, and I'll show you in the rest of the game that this idea of expanding on the queen side is still relevant. My opponent plays b6 here to get it away from the bishop and free up their rook. And now I'll ask you here, what's the correct plan for white? And I know I hinted at it earlier, but if you want to pause again, and I'll tell you in 3, 2, 1. So the best move for white here is to play g4. We want to advance pawns on this side where we are stronger. We don't want to worry about the queen side pawns. This is not where we have the advantage. We're all in on the king side. And after h5, my opponent played, I went bishop f3. And they traded on g4, rook h8, and they have the open file, but my king is adjacent to the open file, so I don't actually have any infiltration squares. So king g2. Rook g8, they're trying to bolster against any sort of f5 break so that they could take it and this g-pawn would be pinned. But I'm just simply moving my king up the board. They go back to b8, but there's just nothing really to be done because I'm just slowly advancing my pieces and I'm preparing f5. We have rook g8, king f3, and now that my king is off the g-file, now I can prepare f5. And it is important not to move too quickly in these types of endgames. You want to make sure that everything is ready. You don't want to play f5 when black could take it favorably. You want to make sure that you can keep everything together. But now after rook h8, I'm all ready. I can play f5, g takes f5, g takes f5, bishop to d7, f6 check. Now, after pushing f6, we are forcing their king to the back rank, king to e8. And now we really see how white has used this advantage now. We have put our pawns really close to the end of the board now. And after bishop d5, we can definitely see the beautiful placement of the white pieces compared to black's pieces that are all on the back rank. and that combined with the extra pawns is more than enough to secure the win. My opponent tries rook h5 to attack the e-pawn, but now white just has a simple tactic here. If you want to think about, so I'll tell you in 3, 2, 1. So I played bishop takes f7 here, and that just deflects the king from the bishop on d7. They have to take, or otherwise I take the rook on h5. So after king takes f7, we take d7, king e6, rook e7, and after king f5, we go f7, and next the pawn is promoting, and my opponent has to resign here. They try to stop it with rook h8. Of course, we know the pattern here, and we go rook e8. And the pawn is just promoting. There's nothing that black can do about it. Okay, so really at the start here, if we go back to the position of interest, you start off by saying, okay, we have this weak d6 pawn, but we need to do something else to increase our advantage. And the way we increase our advantage is we see that we have this 4-on-3 quasi-majority here. So we begin pushing pawns on this side, and we start to force a concession. Again, g6 simply lost a pawn, but I think, let's say, even if they sit and try to get the bishop off of the pawn off that diagonal from the bishop, we could continue with something like g4, and if they just move back and forth, eventually, you know, we're going to make progress like this, g5, knight g8, and then, or knight e8 after. They gotta be watchful of their g7 pawn. There's just way too many weaknesses in the black position. We can continue with something like f5 and h4. We're just gaining so much space, and black is just in big trouble. At bishop c8, actually, you would have e5 even. So eventually, if you push your opponent's pieces back and you gain so much space, you will have these tactical opportunities that start showing up. And that's what you need to be doing when you have a position like this. You want to be gaining space on the side of the board where you're stronger and use that to create that second weakness. And once you do, eventually the opponent's position will collapse either on its own or through a blunder like g6. So I hope that was instructive. I hope you guys had fun, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye.